Today is a day that I have had long coming. It's one that every Admech player can currently relate to. Whether they enjoy it or not, everyone does acknowledge it. As the newest edition came into the limelight, it showed that massive changes would be delivered with it. Games Workshop has had the goal to turn back the lethality and swinginess of the game, allowing all factions to be within a respective bracket of win rate and not left to the wayside after they have received their attention for the edition. Space Marines and Tyranids were the introduction factions and therefore released their codecies first, much to the bewilderment of the player base as they began to accustom themselves to the changes taking place at 10th edition. Soon to come, however, there was 10th edition Mechanicus Codex, one that would hold a lot of controversy, especially when compared to the release of the Necron Codex alongside it. The reaction of the Mechanicus Codex was a cautious one, and an approach that I would largely agree with, but over time became more and more evident on how the days for the old Admech would be the ones to reminisce on. Plainly said, it was garbage, and I think a lot of people were calling it garbage. The reaction from the community at large was to let it cook and settle in, a sentiment that after a month or so, I wholeheartedly despised to hear. The writing was on the wall for how this codex would perform, and yet we all hear how people just didn't figure it out. It was at that point, and it was shit, and it was irritating to hear people say otherwise, to have no knowledge in the army. I'm looking at you Custodes players, sitting on your throne only ready to cry when it was your turn on the chopping block after. Bickering aside, many people have had this sentiment. Necrons would go on to be one of the strongest armies in the meta. The overall sentiment for the Mechanicus went from, they haven't figured it out, to, it just isn't as good compared to 9th, to, yeah, my army isn't great, but at least it's not Admech. Those words, at least it's not Admech, that sentiment, is one that is still alive today. By no means were we the only ones receiving the shit end of the stick. Drukhari was there with us until their new detachment, but our codex was already out, and we had no reason to believe that we would receive an overhaul that would be significant enough to remove that stain of our reputation, especially when giving balancing into consideration in the past. The black pill was one of the easiest ways to interpret the future. Admech has received some support over the months to come. Some wager it's enough to make us healthy for the edition, others not so much. I believe this puts us to where we are now, with a detachment that is capturing some of the aspects that we loved about our army's old playstyle, the ones that many seem not to understand as why we love it so much. This is my aim with this video, not only to capture the failings of the 10th edition codex, but to explain why people hold this sentiment of, at least we are an Admech, and expand upon it. Any player not somewhat knowledgeable with the army can't answer what it is about the codex release that makes it so bad, and others may just understand that our units are wet noodles. But the sentiment isn't fully that we aren't a threatening army, it's that we are no longer a fun army. Why aren't we the Mechanicus, but a watered down guard reskin? To answer that, we need to go back to the editions past and see what we have lost. Admech has always had a reputation for being good at shooting. After all, the premier shooting army slogan was used even in the announcement of the 10th edition codex. The best example of this in the past was the 8th edition Call's Moving Castle list, similar to how current Abaddon Castle lists work. A bunch of units would follow along the reroll aura of Call to shoot devastating firepower into our enemies. This is also the origins of the double shooting Wrath of Mars Castellan, a period of time where everything was right with the world. I bring this comp in particular because it highlights an era of Admech where things were janky, by design, and still decently competitive. I'm not here to say that Call's Moving Castle was top 3 strats of all time, but the people who remember how many shots a Castellan would pump out while being unable to move for the rest of the game is a story that people still bring up 2 editions later. The sins of the Castellan double shooting is one that we pay for now with our anemic robots this edition, as seen by their awful shooting and boring protocols they've had since. 8th edition also saw things like our Tactical Obliqua for the Cerberus Raiders get changes to where they couldn't flat out cancel an opponent's charge. And while I do feel that was a bit over the edge, it was an ability unique to Admech, making games more dynamic between matchup to matchup. Those were all things that were entirely different, and not just flat stat boosts or generically good movement abilities as we have now. That's the point I'm trying to make here. A lot of people have brought up comparisons like Chaos Boon Table for the regard of the watered down rules, but losing your Lord and gaining a Demon Prince is a bit too swingy. Where these abilities gave you something to play around and not just a randomized buff or nerf, nor a flat stat boost. It was something that you can interact with as a player and his opponent has to consider playing around. Moving on to 9th, a bloat of stratagems were in the game, each targeting 1 or 2 specific units. Many of these have been consolidated to unit datasheets in 10th edition, which is something that I wholeheartedly support. This allows more design space around detachment stratagems while removing the massive text that would have been consolidated to a unit's personal abilities. However, in 10th edition, a lot of our units lost things that made them entirely unique. Raiders, for instance, moved from a dedicated screen and sniper to just another movement unit. They were our army's way to position out characters while still being able to shoot into standard infantry with a decent volley, unlike our mediocre one-shot sniper whose damage is extremely swingy. The infiltrators had one of my favorite abilities in the game, cancelling out rerolls of enemy units they were in proximity of, a massive ability with the rising prominence of reroll auras in the game. A mechanic far more unique than what was basically a morale test that really cements the word interference. Skystalkers lost the stratagem ability Deeply Sunk Talons to lock a unit into place and punish your opponent's movement, instead of, yet again, compromising a movement ability like in 10th edition. Mind you, I'm not arguing that a movement ability is bad. If anything, it's good, but it's generically good and unoriginal. The toolkit of the elites in 9th really made them feel like individual and unique units. Even if they didn't punch up like a traditional elite army, they still had their own feel to them as to what they brought to the table, besides X scenario triggers X type of movement. And that's what I genuinely believe makes our elites feel so bland and uninteresting. Next, we move on to the weaponry of the Admech. There was a blog post I read a while ago from someone addressing the changes in 10th edition to reduce the lethality, due to a blatant power creep seen in 9th edition. I think overall the idea was good, but the implementation of it was something this individual pointed out. The reduction of AP does nothing for T3 bodies in this game, especially when weaponry of these T3 bodies are being reduced alongside the rest of the game. In practice, reducing the AP of a weapon while increasing the cover of the game makes it so that 3+ save T4 units are far more capable of surviving small arms fire. This could be seen blatantly with the infiltrators or Skystalker blocks shooting 25 to 50 shots and only managing to get through 4 wounds at a 2 to 3+ save into many types of infantry, or how the Surfle Hounds, having a strength 3 flamer, makes them one of the most neglected units in our army. The Admech has had Cognis weaponry to show that it's a cut above what it distributes to the Imperium, its weapons having usually a pip of AP higher or more reliable damage, like the Cognis Las Cannon being D3+3 rather than D6. And I don't entirely expect Admech to be miles above its Imperium counterparts, but I do expect the cybernetic assassins without human limitations, with blades for hands, to hit on something higher than a 4. I expect the army that has very little melee support like this to not have 0 AP on a large majority of its elite datasheets. Our supposed heavy guns, such as the Onager Dunecrawler, nicknamed the Casino Crab by the community, either got a gun with D6 shots at a 2-3 damage, or a 2-shot gun with D6+1. Either way, you're gambling. The Iron Strider with the 2-barreled las cannons who only got 1 shot, but thank God that my 12 strength las cannon can re-roll. D6+1 by the way, from our Cognis D3+3, and this is the only thing you take this unit for. The controversy of Admech going to a 4+ ballistic skill is one that has been relevant even to this day, and on some metric I understand trying to move the scale to allow for more shooting focused elite units to shine through with a 3+ ballistic skill. But Admech needs to have the edge on something if you're going to try and sell it as a premier shooting army that it's supposed to be, and we'd largely lost that with our Cognis weaponry and ballistic skill. For this, I'd like to draw an example between all the other armies in the game, and mind you, we are comparing this to the Codex launch before the data slate changes. Even so, this still kind of holds up to this day. Every army has had good shooting in its predominant means of damage as some degree of edge over its disadvantages. The Guard, for example, has poor ballistic skill, but makes that up with massive shots. Your Leman Russ may hit on 4s, but it has more than 5 guns on it to be capable of spiking high damage or high volume. And you have like 6 tanks in the field. The Tau have means to buff themselves in their ballistic skill while having less shots overall, but they can punch a hole through anything with their high damage railguns. The Space Marines have a consistent 3+ with very good melee range to protect and compensate any damage that isn't made through shooting. The Votan can mark units to increase their stats flat out into hitting and wounding, while also having the means to manipulate their wounds through conversion abilities. And what did we get to compensate for a 4+ ballistic skill? Heavy. stay still and lose the game. Or assault, which became the de facto method to play the army. The old Doctrinas gave Protector the rule where AP would be worsened against your units by 1, similar to Armor of Contempt, but only within your deployment zone. This encouraged a KG playstyle where moving would worsen your ballistic skill and your ability to survive, in a game where 4 out of 5 primary objectives are outside of your deployment zone. Not to mention how most secondaries want you in various parts of the battlefield. The Conquer Doctrina did the opposite, granting your shooting AP by 1 if shooting at targets within your opponent's deployment zone. Good luck with that considering all the terrain between your deployment zone and theirs, not to mention that units only have to move out of the area to significantly reduce the lethality on your entire army's shooting. We have only really had half of an army rule, and some units they didn't even get the rule at all. It's no wonder that having army-wide assault only meant that we were trying to scrape off wounds while doing our primary playstyle of move blocking and flooding. We lost the reliable weaponry that carried lethality, we lost the reliable aim to whittle down our opponents with consistency, and we lost the uniqueness that made any of our units fun to play. We lost both our competitive and our creative edge. Is it any wonder why this army wasn't fun to play? The army rule has been overhauled and it's definitely better than what it used to be, but it continues to have problems. Firstly, on how the buffs are tied to the battle line. From a lore perspective, the troops that are programmed to be controlled by tech priests when necessary makes no sense as them being the point of where the buffs come from. It puts a considerable amount of emphasis on your chaff to remain protected, and to the best of my knowledge, we're the only army in the game that can be significantly debuffed by losing the units that are meant to be the most disposable. Skitarii will die to a swift breeze, posing a decent amount of threat and firepower and being our best objective contesting unit. These guys are pivotal to our army rule. Losing a block means not only that you lose board presence, but damage to everything that was within 6 inches of them. You lose a third of your army rule if they are not around or die. The rewrite of this rule only barely brings out a potential to play the Protector Doctrina, giving you -1 when hit in melee, a buff that only delays the inevitable since most of our units' weapon skill is also 4 and barely threatening. Compare that to all the things we've had to play in 9th, with the Canticles of the Omnissiah and the Doctrina Imperatives. Each benefited the Skitarii and the Cult Mechanicus unit in a way that was meaningful and engaging. While Canticles were very basic, similar to the newly introduced creations of Bile, I believe that the 9th edition Doctrina Imperatives highlighted the best and the most enjoyable parts of playing the Mechanicus. Simply put, a unit would be individually buffed or nerfed, usually being opposites of each other, gaining +1 weapon skill at the cost of -1 ballistic skill, and vice versa, or getting movement at the cost of a worsened save. Each unit being tinkered and programmed exactly to how you need them to be for the scenario at hand, while as we covered earlier, every unit having an ability unique to handling a situation. This doesn't even include the holy orders that priests could carry, a massive buff that can be changed into another the following turn when you need it. Again, further adjusting on how your units are responding to the situation at hand. This led to the 30-minute command phase meme and the consult the flowchart, and honestly, it's what made Admech so great. Our units weren't insane in lethality, but they had some, and they could make up and even punch up to armies by meticulously buffing while exposing other parts of yourself. It made you have a fundamental understanding in the game sense and in army mechanics. It made you interact with your opponent and a board state meaningfully. It made it fun and engaging. It was not taking Iron Striders because they are tanky and cheap. It wasn't taking Vanguards because they contested points well. It wasn't rolling advance on every unit and hoping you still can sit on points and wait to die. Admech has seen an incremental climb to be an army with decent to good stats that make or break by the knowledge of stacking your buffs as necessary, and playing around these negatives that the buffs would also bring. It built up more and more with the introduction of Doctrinas and Holy Orders. It was a lot, but it was rewarding. The sentiment of Admech being a hard army and one that is time consuming is a measure of skill expression and familiarity. It is not a bug or a downside to this army. The Gene Stealer cults have been notoriously tricky to play, and yet that is what draws people into the army. And as such, I do not believe this sentiment that Admech was too complicated, because that is the very trait that made it so appealing for many. Without it, we would have a simple stance switch like many armies in the game right now, and that feels rather dull. The detachments of this codex are unbelievably poor. and it's very simple to lump them into Skitarii Hunter cohort and not Skitarii Hunter cohort. While I am being a little facetious, there are blatant design mistakes here that become more apparent with the release of every other army's codex. Let's take the infamous Explorator Maniple for example, the one that I found to be extremely heinous. Simply put, the rule is to pick one objective marker, and if you are within range or attack something that is within range of that marker, you get to reroll wound rolls of 1. Not to mention that a lot of the stratagems in this army focused entirely around the one objective that you get to mark per turn. An especially terrible design is Reactive Safeguard, a stratagem so pigeonholed it's just trash. On your opponent's charge phase, infantry within range of the marked objective that was selected as a target of a charge can re-embark to the transport if they are within 3 inches of Skitarii unit for 1 CP. Let me be clear, you have to be getting charged with a unit to be able to move back, provided that that objective is your acquisition marker and they are within 3 inches of that transport, and that transport needs to be there. What kind of jumping through hoops is that? Skitarii Hunter cohort can literally do it after shooting and move 6 inches anywhere on the map. Doesn't matter what objective you're on, and it doesn't cost a CP. Speaking of command point, you can pay 1 and get an additional acquisition marker with Info Slave Skull, provided that you are within 24 inches and it has to be Attack Priest. You can lose half of your CP over a match to have 2 objectives where you can reroll wound roll. Thank the Omnisire for that, GW. Very cool. Meanwhile, Renegade Raiders in CSM gets to have an additional AP so long as they are fighting within an objective marker and assault army-wide. Arguably, the Explorator Maniple and the best part of our Doctrina within a single detachment, not counting Dark Pacts, while they have far deadlier synergies in their datasheets and stats. It is honestly a spit to the face when the premier shooting army can't hold a candle to an army that also smashes them in the face just as hard. Cohort Cybernetica is known widely as the most uncreative writing in a codex since 10th edition, where only 1 unit from your army is barred, the army rule, so that your detachment can give it to them. Literally nothing else. And honestly, what else needs to be said about such a bankruptcy in creativity and design? By the way, with all the band-aids that we've been receiving over these little boo-boos, the detachment utterly unchanged. No changes. Gotta give Space Marines that +1 to wound on Oaths and Moments though, GW, right? While we sit with Strength 3 Flamers. The rest of the detachments are just standard fare, decent, and okay. Radzone wants to play around an army rule that is limited to your opponent's deployment zone, while doing a whopping 1 mortal wound every turn after the first, but has some decent enchantments to help your stronger units thrive. Data Som can be a huge hit or miss, able to fix the damage portions of an army, but still has us falling to pieces if played incorrectly. So, what do you do when the damage is mediocre at best and your units break like Legos from a 10-foot fall? You go to the Skitarii Hunter cohort, a detachment where you watch everything you've worked towards painting and assembling flood the board and die turn after turn. If you can't deal damage, then don't let your opponent deal damage. All your Skitarii have stealth. I'm sure they are having a blast seeing their Forge Fiend not being able to chew and move through 50 Skitarii and 30 Paraxi birds dropping from the sky to do damn near nothing. Move block your opponents and let them do nothing meaningful in the process. Throw things into the meat grinder and hope to God that your opponents can't chew through it. And maybe you'll just be lucky enough to win. If it's not fun for us to miss all the time, put that curse on your opponent and play an absolutely miserable 3-hour game of Warhammer 40k. This is why the Halos Creed is so revered, and I covered it on my last video. It doesn't devolve to cheap tricks that feel poor or poor rules that feel like they are not cohesive. It brought forth a playstyle familiar to us that allowed us to manipulate the units to fill in the cracks and pump them up to a level where they can punch or shoot up. Halos Creed, the detachment that came out months later, is the closest Mechanicus Codex that we've had to the goddamn Codex itself. Finally, our last stop is the pricing, and we won't stay here too long as this is definitely part of the meme of people relating themselves to us. Admech has always been along the lines of Sisters or Necrons for semi-elite, just a point above Horde but not something like Space Marines. Our kit were definitely priced that way, but with the transition to Horde and lower price costs, the price of our kits have stayed the same, the Iron Strider being the most blatant example. being able to be taken as low as 45 points per model as a dragon with a Jezzail, or 50 as a Ballistari variant during its codex release. This puts us at less than 1 point per dollar at the time. This is absurd and frankly an abuse to consumers. Seeing this with the following changes we got over the last few months, the Iron Strider finally breaks 1 point per dollar, being costed at 75 points today for the Iron Strider variant, while the kit remains at a $60 US price tag. Let's see how long that lasts considering the annual price increases. Sulfur Hounds are still priced at 55 points for a $60 kit, and containing 3 models with some of the worst profiles in our army. Poorhammer did a great analysis of this a year ago, where the average purchasing power of an Admech army was 1.49 points per dollar, and $100 would net you below 150 points on average. This is insane for an army to be pushed down in power while priced as something that is above that. And don't get it twisted with this "it's equal to the material cost" nonsense. Otherwise, leaders like the Dominus wouldn't be priced at $42, almost reaching a 10-man Skitarii box price of $58 for a quarter of the material in the box. Admech is the most expensive army to buy into average by a huge margin, and GW's Band-Aid data slate fixes have done nearly nothing to fix this. And honestly, why would they? I genuinely believe they saw the ability to sell these kits at a price and believe the consumer would buy them. They are in charge of the design, the pricing, and the point cost of all of their armies, and there is no other place to reasonably direct responsibility. And for an army that is universally praised for its unique design and distinct models, the players of this faction have largely answered GW's price gouging by ditching the army altogether, lending credence to the fact that no one really knows Admech rules or utter the phrase, "at least we aren't Admech," because that is all we are known for: shit design and shit prices. And I don't blame them. GW single-handedly shot themselves in the foot by alienating an entire army through these gross practices, and honestly, with the rising popularity of 3D printing taking over the market for cheaper alternatives to their 1.49 point per dollar ratio, they get what they fucking deserve. With that, we come to an end to our examination and analysis of the Admech Codex at launch, and some of the things that have come to change. While not accounting for everything they have changed, this was to show that GW believed at some point that this was a good product to push out and asking $60 for a glorified paperweight. This codex would set the trend for badly written codices released that hold some water, and how 10th edition has a gaping chasms with design and creativity. I hope to show people the outrage that this army has dealt with, and why the practices of GW are pushing away its core player base time and time again. I say this because I love the setting in the game, but I do not wish to participate with GW products, so long as they are continuing to try and push their luck with these terrible decisions against the demographic they are trying to sell to. The biggest reason for this channel's creation was my love for Admech and 40k as a whole rapidly dwindling, and I wanted to recapture my fascination of this franchise through content creation. And I believe with the territory comes my attempt of valid and honest criticism of their product that I can relate myself to, and frankly, they aimed for the stars and got lost in the cold reaches of space. This also isn't something that I'm trying to say that Admech should be top 3 armies, or top 5, or top 10. My point is that whether this army continues to be at a 47% win rate, I want to be able to enjoy playing the game, whether it's casually or competitively. But the way that these units are designed, the way that the army is priced, and the way that we play on the tabletop with our current stats make it so that we cannot have fun. I hope you all gained some insight on this issue, and my work here paid off at least a little bit. If you found this informative, interesting, or entertaining at least, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel, and checking out some of the other content. Additionally, I'd like to thank you all for helping me reach the 100 subscriber triple-digit milestone. I cannot express how incredible it's been to see someone who cares that I invested my time into my content. I'd also like to announce a Patreon and Ko-Fi to this channel, as I'd like to start flipping support back to this community. I've made the tiers very low entry monetarily since I don't really have much to give at the moment, but I intend to start firstly with a giveaway of a leader of your choice should you win. More to follow on how we'll set up that raffle on a future video and a post here on YouTube. And on the donation services, if you find this interesting, please consider checking those out. I want to give a final shout out to the Mechanicus subreddit for giving me some of their thoughts of the state of Admech through personal accounts they've had experienced and felt, which greatly contributed to the content of this video. Thank you all very, very much for hearing me yap for nearly 4,500 words, and I will see you next time.